All right, folks, David Parsons here. Welcome to Nostalgia Trap. I hope you are doing well, despite the fact that we continue to spin our way into a very unsettling future. And we will have more to say about that on our News Trap episode this Friday. If you're a subscriber to the Nostalgia Trap Patreon, then you are aware of our News Trap episodes and what we do. But this Friday, my good friend and podcasting partner, Justin Rogers Cooper, will be sharing with us a lot of ideas from the international press that he has collected, insights and takes on what is going on with Trump and Greenland and Europe, and the real disorder and chaos that the United States is now entering us into with Trump as president. It's incredibly disturbing stuff. But Justin, as always, helps me think through what's really important, what's the wider view, and what we might expect in the future. So tune in for that. Subscribe to our Patreon if you haven't done that already, and you'll get all our News Trap updates. But today I want to talk about resistance and the history of resistance, as we often do on this program. The 1960s and 1970s is a time where there was a lot of activism, both in the United States and worldwide, not only against the Vietnam War, but for gay rights, feminism, and a general kind of youth counterculture vibe that there's been a lot written about. There's a lot of documentaries about this period, but so much of that historical material focuses on college campuses. I think we're still in a moment where we focus a lot on college campuses when we think about resistance. But my guest today is Aaron G. Fountain Jr. He is a historian and public scholar and the author of a new book out from the University of North Carolina Press. The book is called High School Students Unite: Teen Activism, Education Reform, and FBI Surveillance in Postwar America. This is a perspective that we need. We need to hear from the kids. And what Aaron lays out in this book and what he describes in this conversation is a million different instances of young people coming together on a local level to fight for their rights and to fight for the larger picture of the Vietnam War and the sort of choking Cold War culture that they grew up in. This is a really, really important story. And, you know, it has its roots probably in the civil rights movement, the 1940s and 1950s, as he explains. But he has so many great stories to tell us in this conversation. I really enjoyed learning from him. Go check out the book. Thanks so much for being a Nostalgia Trap listener. Here is my conversation with Aaron G. Fountain Jr. Dr. Aaron Fountain, welcome to Nostalgia Trap. Thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it too.
You have a book out from UNC Press that caught my attention, and I think that people that listen to Nostalgia Trap will appreciate your perspective. It's called High School Students Unite: Teen Activism, Education Reform, and FBI Surveillance in Post-War America. A subject near and dear to my heart, and I think to a lot of us in a lot of ways, because one of the things you point out right at the beginning of your book is that I think you've got a great quote from Kurt Vonnegut about how high school is just sort of like, it's like a microcosm of our whole life experience. And it's hard to shake your high school experiences. And it feels like, I don't know, I like hearing about origin stories. I wonder how you got to high school as a subject for a book about American history.
Yeah, I get this question a lot, and I don't mind saying it. So I'll be brief in the first part. So I was not an activist in high school. I attended 8 different high schools in 3 states. So it was not really possible. But I did get much more interested in politics. I always was, as I was a kid watching ABC World News with Peter Jennings with my aunt, who, older people watch the news all the time. But how I got interested in this subject was really by accident. I was an undergraduate student with ambitions to go to graduate school, but never did a independent research project or any kind of original research project. And a friend of mine told me about the McNair Scholars Program, which is an undergraduate program designed to diversify the professorate. I applied, got accepted, and was told that I had to create an original research project, which I had no idea what I wanted to write about. I'm like, well, can I write about the Friendship Nine? I went to school in Rock Hill, South Carolina, but my professor was like, that's been overwritten. I had so many students write about that. So, I just thought and thought. And then when I was taking a public speaking course, one of the assignments was to do a persuasive speech. So I decided I was going to do one on whether under God should be in a Pledge of Allegiance. That took me to a book by political scientist Richard Ellis called titled To the Pledge, and which is a general history of the Pledge of Allegiance. And sorry. Hmm. And in the book, he has a section, there's a chapter that has a section about students who sat during the Pledge of Allegiance in the 1960s and 70s as a form of political protest against the Vietnam War, against racism and other issues. And it made me, I just wanted to learn more about that. I know there's a story behind every court case. So that's what I did my first summer research project on. I did archival research and I interviewed people. And in the end, I thought that the paper honestly sucked. I thought that then, I still think that now. Oh my God,
You
that
got
paper.
to start somewhere.
Yeah, and ironically, sometimes bad projects can lead to something else. But when I was doing the research, I saw so many references of high school students involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement and civil rights. And I remember thinking to myself, like, wow, I had no idea that teenagers in the 60s were this politically active. And generally, we think about student activism, we always think about college campuses. So that made me think, like, okay, so how did the Vietnam War, an event I have a lifelong fascination in as a kid, affect teenagers, teachers, and administrators? And I came across Gail Graham's book, Young Activists, American Teenagers in the Age of Protest. Age of Protest. And it's a broad overview of high school student activism. So I decided I was going to expand on the anti-Vietnam War movement. I chose the San Francisco Bay Area. No connection, but as I tell people, I'm pretty sure I would have found more there than Rock Hill, South Carolina.
Mm.
And yeah, and then the McNair Scholars Program, they actually booked a trip for me. So I went there for a week and did field research. So I did archival research in like Berkeley. Actually, I went all over. In retrospect, I think being ignorant about research projects helped because I didn't really go to the Bay Area with this idea like, oh, I'm only going to focus on these particular communities. I went all around the Bay Area, Richmond, Hayward, San Mateo County, and found a great archive by a former school principal who had like boxes of 600 pages of documents on high school unrest in Palo Alto, a suburb. Because generally, you don't think of suburbs as being political spaces or
Right.
spaces of radical politics. So yeah, that paper was much better. And when I got to grad school, I knew that this is what I wanted to write about. The book actually is structured in a way that I envision a doctoral dissertation. And if there's any graduate students listening, don't ever try to write a book like this for your dissertation. Focus on like three locations. Because in the retrospect, I'm like, oh my goodness, they must have thought I was crazy to write about 7 different places. Like, just pick three maximum. So for dissertation, I decided to focus on the Bay Area, and I covered high school activism broadly. And the book is more nationwide. Of course, a book like this, I knew when I was writing this that high school student activism was national. And I was getting a little bothered by people who kept assuming that, oh, yeah, of course that would occur in the Bay Area, but not where I'm from or where I live. I'm like, no, this
Right.
was all 50 states, and not to mention not the territory of Puerto Rico, and it occurred in public, private, Catholic boarding schools, and believe it or not, even Department of Defense dependent schools, a network of schools that exists in Europe and the Pacific. And international too. There's high school student activism in Canada, Panama, Finland, France, England, Italy, Ethiopia, India, Australia, New Zealand. That's what we know so far. So
Love
that's
that.
just the
Wow.
origin project of this, the origins of this project.
Wow. So yeah, I mean, it's funny because youth was such a buzzword in the 60s, but people think it seems like so much of it, including in all the like cliche documentaries and movies, it's always, yeah, college. And I felt the same way when I was doing my project about the Vietnam War. I was like, what were the high school kids up to? Because they were like popping up here and there. To me, like your project sounds really fascinating and really like it could lead to a million other projects. Like there's like it seems like there's a lot left unsaid, like because there's so much high school stuff, right? During this era, it's like almost a totally untold story.
The thing about this book was that when I first did my when I did the summer research project in the San Francisco Bay Area and chose the Vietnam War, I remember I didn't find as much as I thought I would, and my professor was like, "Don't you wish you have chosen to study race instead?" Because it was like I found way more stuff about racial issues than the anti-Vietnam War stuff. But
Uh,
over time, I learned I just wasn't looking in the right spaces. Like you just can't rely solely on mainstream newspapers and school campus newspapers because those are really restricted. It was literally their actions and their writings were in the underground press, newspapers that they created, but also like GI newspapers as well as anti-war organization, particularly the Student Mobilization Committee, which I talk about extensively in the book. But the hard part about writing this book, even though originally it was seen as like too hard to write about, in fact, in Gail Graham's book, Young Activist, she does reference constantly that there's not a lot of sources. But in the course of 13 years, I found that there's just too many sources. And the hard part about writing this book wasn't what to include, it was what to omit. Because I
mm,
didn't want to write standard academic books where we have like an argument in a chapter, then you get like 3 dozen examples to uphold that argument. I actually wanted to humanize the people I was talking about and let you know the intricacies and the complexities of not just their characters, but of these stories. So yeah, there's not a whole lot as I would have loved to write about like feminism and gay liberation and
mhm.
even the different dynamics of how student activism plays out in like boarding schools and whatnot. So, but I think the way I wrote it is so far, I think representative of what the high school movement was and how interconnected, how connected this was. Because law enforcement certainly knew that this was a connected movement, not isolated instances of activism.
Yeah, it feels like there. I noticed in the way that you've arranged your book, there are like some broad categories like politics, race, and then surveillance. Like it feels like all of those things cannot be disentangled. Like it feels like especially when you get towards the end of your book and you're talking more about the FBI and law enforcement response to this, the change in the way they do security in schools, because like so many people would think like, oh, okay, we got metal detectors in schools now, and that's just a response to crime, And you're sort of like there is a wider context there, and I'm wondering like what what were the things that were making young people active during this era? Like, what were the politics about? I know you say the Vietnam War and civil rights and those sorts of things, but what were their takes on what was going on, and how was it connected to their experience as high school students?
Yeah, so what happens is that because of coming out of the civil rights and anti-Vietnam War movement, when students are participating in various forms of activism, they inevitably bring it to their schools. I mean, if you're trying to recruit your peers, school is where you're going to meet most people of your same age. It's hard to find people outside of school, even during the summer, who are around the same age as you. But when they bring these partisan politics to campus, they often clash with school administrators who are trying to keep these partisan politics out of campus. And it could be anything from like a poster placed on a bulletin board or a student who comes to school with a leaflet or underground newspaper. These are all unauthorized activities. And the school administrators are responding logically. I mean, they're people, they can easily lose their job for the school board. If parents think that the school is like chaotic and not run properly, they can certainly voice that to the school board, which in turn can retaliate. So there is definitely this clash. And over time, this clash, it really becomes a clash where people realize like, okay, the students are going to participate in these movements and we can't really stop them. So how can we try to accommodate them? But as students are increasingly facing like repression over like civil rights and anti-war activism, etc., you get this unique ideology that I identify as high school student radicalism, which has like 2 components. The first is that high school students constitute an oppressed group analogous to poor people, women, and racial minorities.
Mhm.
And what happens over time is that students start to believe that school reform was a prerequisite to true societal reform. Essentially, you could not truly reform society unless you first reform the high schools. Now, how does an ideology like that come about? Well, after World War II, receiving a secondary education became increasingly a part of modern citizenship. And I mean, when I say modern citizenship, I'm talking about like socially, like will you be gainfully employed? Will you be civically engaged? Will you be an informed voter? Because prior to the 1960s, less than half of the adult population population had a high school diploma. It wasn't as necessary to get like a decent paying job. But, after World War II, especially in 1960, there's an increasing number of high school students, increasing number of teenagers who are enrolled in high school than ever before. And the high school diploma becomes much more important to be a productive member of society. So that's why they argue that every inequality you see, racial, social, etc., is all stemming from the high school. So we have to reform this first until we get a broader, more egalitarian society. So that's largely what they're asking, responding to.
Yeah, it reminds me of the free speech movement at Berkeley. They're like, these students are getting involved in things like the anti-nuclear activism and the civil rights movement and things like that, and the school is saying you're not allowed to do this in this in the college level, and that sort of instigated a whole reaction from the students who were like really standing up for their rights as citizens and their the idea of free speech. That seems like it's a uniting factor for in a lot of these movements. Like the same thing happened in the military when they told the military guys that you're not allowed to do underground newspapers, you're not allowed to be active on these issues. It pisses people off. It makes people like sort of united in the idea that like no, we're allowed to do this and we're citizens too. It's especially hard though, and this is a subject you obviously know more about than I do, but when these are kids, I mean, I know that they don't like to be called kids. But they're like under 18. It's a different legal category, even. You know what I mean? Like, did they struggle over the idea of like, do we actually have rights here?
Yeah, that was before the 1969 Supreme Court decision in Taker v. Des Moines. The idea of whether like a teenager had constitutional rights was just in flux. Like nobody really knew. Even when they argued that, there was really no legal basis that they can refer and saying, "Oh, this is what gives us legal rights." I mean, the idea among a lot of school administrators, among a lot of parents, was that schools are just as democratic as a household is. You punish your kid, you don't put them on trial and have due process. It's just like you do what I
Yeah.
say. And not to mention being kids in Cold War America, it's like, well, can they listen to controversial opinions? There were students who tried to invite members of the Communist Party, and that could cause a kerfuffle in many neighborhoods. It happened in Berkeley. That's a story that's not included in the book, but my doctoral dissertations. And generally, students they knew that they wanted to have rights, but they would contact the ACLU. But at the time, the ACLU didn't really know the definition. It's not until Tinker v. Des Moines that students receive some First Amendment rights in school, as long as they don't cause disruption. That's not an absolutist thing. The hard part about law is one thing what the law says is another thing how it's enforced. Many school administrators, but judges too, narrowly interpret Tinker. So there's court cases that occur after the Supreme Court decision where school officials and judges narrowly interpret what the decision meant. So there was a case in East Cleveland, Ohio, where a student wears a button to try to promote an upcoming anti-war demonstration. And when it goes to court, the judge says that, like, oh, well, Tinker didn't say about potential disruption. So this case is a little different. So there's another case
Wow.
in Texas, actually, that I'm writing about in my second book, where about 40 students come to school wearing black armbands, identical to Tinker, yet the judge said, like, no, the administrators had a sincere fear that disruption was going to occur. So this case is totally different.
That's really fascinating because so much of American history is this story of like, okay, we've got, these concepts of legal rights and embodying the Constitution, but when these documents were written, so many groups of people were left out, and the story of American history then is a lot of these groups sort of winning their rights through various means, right? And like I feel like high school students and kids are not a category that we talk about as much, in terms of like, do children have rights and what rights do they have? And are they included in what we think of as constitutional liberty? That's really, God, your project, I think, is so important. It keys into something really, I think, still on the scene in terms of how we think about like who is a human being and who gets to have rights.
hmm No, I absolutely agree. I mean, it's even though with the high school movement, it still gets debated whether teenagers have rights. I mean, there's still teenagers that get
Yeah.
suspended for like dress codes, policies, and like underground newspaper. It's so contentious because they're not just it's not just law, but they're also fighting against old ideas about what it means to be a kid, or and a
Right.
belief that kids are easily manipulated. At what age do they become a mature adult and they can think for themselves? That's what the first chapter of the book outlines, the what I call the San Francisco high school free speech movement, which is not like Berkeley. There's nobody standing on top of a police vehicle and speaking out to an audience. It's more so it's a citywide campaign against a district-wide ban against an underground newspaper titled The Activist Opinion, which the superintendent at the time dismissed as communistic, and a group of students calling themselves the Students Organized Education and Action League go to the school board, and they have these really rigorous debates of like, what's the purpose of education, what's the purpose of schools, and when is a teenager somehow mature enough, what age is a person mature enough to make their derive at their own thoughts and conclusions about
Mm,
issues.
wow.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I always have in my head this like cycle, and it might be a cliche, but it's a kind of broad take on what happens in the 60s and what happens with the left, where how you have these like college movements that start in the early 60s, and by the time you get to the later 60s, they're becoming more radical. You end up with like the Weather Underground, splits over race. You got the Black Panthers happening. And then, like all, it sort of devolves in the 1970s. Is that a cycle that happens for the high school kids too? Do they become like more radical? They become communists, and I'm just sort of wondering like how they relate to the older left, if that makes sense. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's definitely different because the issue with high school organizing is that it's so localized. I mean, I
Yeah.
do talk a lot in the book about like citywide and national, even international networks, but for the most part, I mean, you do get like vibrant anti-war movements in New York, Chicago, and like San Francisco as early as 65, going into like the late 60s, early 70s. But cities like Atlanta, students don't get organized until 1970. Same with
Mm,
like Austin, Texas, and the Pacific Northwest. A guy I interviewed from Portland, he's like, yeah, there wasn't much of an anti-war scene when he moved there as a high school student in the late 1960s. So no, what happens in the late by the late 1960s, the difference for high school students is that their activism becomes much more connected. There's like the anti-war movement, high school anti-war activism is burgeoning. The high school underground press is becoming more organized by connecting students across the United States, Canada, England, Australia, and New Zealand. And yeah, the media picks this up too. One thing that happens while there's no schisms because there's no national organization dictating what people do, there is increasing surveillance that happens against high school students beginning in 68 going to 70. In fact, that's like the bulk of like surveillance operation against high school students. And the national media picks this up too, and they start to, but they're more fascinated. It's like adults get scared, that's where the surveillance come in. But national media is just like, oh my God, what's going on? They go in the various communities. There's books like the High School Revolutionaries, where these two teachers travel across the country and interview students just to learn more about what's going on in the high schools. You get
wow.
books titled like How Old Will You Be in 1984 or Our Time Is Now, which is curated selections of articles from the high school underground press, and even there's a Emmy award-winning television show called Room 222, and they have
Yeah.
several episodes dedicated to high school student activism. I actually have the DVDs, so I see the episodes, but now I think you can watch them on YouTube. So no, it's a mix of fascination and fear against
Yeah.
high school student activism, but no schisms because there's just no national organization to dictate what students do.
Interesting. So yeah, you have a bunch of like just localized movements. I'm
Mhm.
wondering, because famously the Nixon administration is concerned deeply with two groups. They're the white radical anti-war people and the black nationalist groups. But how much were they concerned with high schoolers? How much was this on the radar of the FBI? I mean, I know from your book that they were concerned about it, but it's not something I've heard a lot about. Like, how much were they like going crazy about kids?
So it wasn't the kids themselves, it was the belief that organizations and were targeting teenagers. So FBI, they started investigating high school students as early as 1961, but the bulk of these investigations occurred in the Vietnam War era. So 65 to 72, and by 73, there's not really any new investigations. Those are usually the continuation of other ones that continued prior. So in 1968, it's interesting. So there's always this belief that these unidentified groups like communists are targeting teenagers. In 1968, after the Columbia University uprising, SDS starts to take on more prominence among in the national psyche and the FBI. That's when the FBI opens up COINTELPRO New Left. And also in that year, a pamphlet that was published in 1965 towards school reform, published by a high school SDS members, which has a lot of the same critiques that high school students have of their education, that reemerges and leads the Committee of Internal Security by the U.S. Congress. They published a document called SDS Plans to Organize High School Students. They call this document the blueprint for the radicalization of high school students. And there is legitimate concern because SDS does try to recruit teenagers, but they just fail. They're horrible at it. They would arrive to schools randomly, which is one of the worst things you could do because most high school students are apathetic. And when they would come, the students would ignore them, debate them, some cases beat them up. There's this
Yeah.
incident in Pittsburgh
Jeez.
where they tried to incite a student walkout, so a bunch of people run through the hallway in the nude, and nothing happens, of course. No, students are not going to follow that. They probably just thought it was really awkward.
Uh-huh.
But it does have consequences. The fear that SDS was going to radicalize high schools really picks up in 1969 when you get these widespread media reports that occur in like almost any major or small town newspaper across the country. That's when I start seeing parents increasingly contact the FBI worried about SDS. And I mean, the fear was overblown. There definitely were high school students, there were high school SDS chapters because teenagers are attracted to notoriety, but they were independent actually. But they popped up in like places like St. Louis and Los Angeles and even like Honolulu, Hawaii. Yeah, pretty much everywhere. But again, independent, didn't have any connection with SDS, but there were, you had education conferences. In fact, a woman from Indianapolis mailed me documents her father had. He was a high school principal in the area. And I see the notes he had at a conference he attended, and you see in his notes he scribbled SDS threats to high school students. And even like the Toastmasters in Jackson, Mississippi pledged to go across the state to warn students about the dangers of SDS. And you get like editorials in major newspapers calling SDS a sinister organization that's going to target high school students. Ronald Reagan, the governor at the time, accused them of trying to target high school students. But this never reaches like Richard Nixon. I couldn't find any statement from Nixon or even Johnson about the fear of SDS targeting high school students. This is largely like local and very statewide, but it's national, but it doesn't reach like the White House. Politicians, yes, on in the Senate, definitely.
That's really interesting. I mean, it makes sense that there would be like, even if it's just at the local level, like hysteria about like they're getting to our kids, they're brainwashing our kids. I mean, you hear that now with all sorts of different issues. Like it's always been there, but it's really interesting to me that it's like the anti-war movement is going to get to our kids. Like we're going to be like to me, it feels like I mean, some parents might have been supportive of that. You know what I mean? Like it feels like there would be at least some interaction between like a older people and high school students that's almost supporting their actions. Does that make sense?
No, I know what you mean. Actually, the thing about outside agitators is very nuanced. Because the thing, like one person I interviewed from Milwaukee told me as teenagers, we don't have access to media or publishing and how sometimes people don't even know how to organize. So they often would go to adults for assistance and were actually delighted that it took them seriously. Yet those adults knew that if teenagers were going to organize, they had to do it themselves because
Yeah.
as teenagers are geriatric. I interviewed people who told me like, yeah, the organizer, they were only like 20 or 21, but at 16, we saw them as old. Well, these some old guys.
That's
And
so
there was
funny.
some tensions too.
Yeah.
Particularly I think black students were actually they black students and just and Latino students, they were more open to collaborating with adults, especially like, Black Panther parties and Brown Berets, but white students were really skeptical of aligning themselves with like SDS. In fact, sometimes they didn't even like them. One schism that occurs in New York City is when students are like, oh God, these SDS guys, they have no idea what's going on in high schools and they just
Yeah.
abandon their national syndicate and join the high school free student union, New York High School Student Union. So it's a mix of there's collaboration, but there's a lot of tensions. And like I said, adults, they don't really, some do try to like indoctrinate kids, but again, I say they just fail because they just had the worst strategies imaginable.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because I've taught American history surveys for way too many years, and I show clips from Eyes on the Prize. Still, it's still like one of the most valuable things to show like the sort of world of the civil rights movement. And there's a lot of high school kids in those documentaries, and they're like black high school kids that are part of the desegregation thing that's going on in the South, and they seem like they are working with adults. You know what I mean? Like there's like a organized civil rights movement that is intentionally sort of training these high school students in how to resist nonviolently, how to like do the thing that they're doing down there, and that part of it is really striking because these kids are educated already in sort of the strategy of not just nonviolence, but like the sort of larger picture of what they're doing. And it's adults that are doing that. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? Like it feels like, so in other words, what you're saying here is that like later on, it makes sense then that there would be a sort of connection between the sort of older movements between like with black kids and Latino kids to the larger civil rights organizations that are there. With white kids and the SDS, they were like, I don't know. In my story of the GI coffee houses, these were some like scrappy hippie dudes that were sort of I don't know. They had very often, I think, sort of abstract revolutionary ideas, if that
Mhm.
makes sense, that weren't so connected to local strategies for actually getting something done. And I know that's a really broad stereotype, but that
No, it's
makes
broad, and
sense.
not to mention you talk about organizing high school students. In fact, in High School Revolutionaries, one person I interviewed, the person in the first book, the prologue, Steve Wasserman, he actually comments when he's like 17, like, yeah, some high school radicals, they're too sophisticated. They go to teenage, they talk about imperialism. It's like the average teenager doesn't know what imperialism means. He's like, you gotta talk to them in a way that relates to their everyday like issues or everyday whatever they're encountering. So
Yeah.
related to like dress code or talk about like, the inability to free speech in the campus newspapers. That's what really organized teenagers when it's something that relates to their everyday life, not these abstract ideas about imperialism. They just can't relate to that.
That totally makes sense. That's what happened at these coffee houses, these GI coffee houses. Many of them were trying to do like a sort of almost like indoctrination or education program on those concepts, and it just wasn't as popular as like the stuff that was connected directly to what was happening in the town.
Hmm.
Yeah, I wonder. That it's not just the left that was active in in the 60s, right? And like
Hmm.
where do the sort of reactionary high school students fall into that? Because I've told a million times my experience here in the suburbs of Southern California growing up, my high school experience, there were some left kids, but they were more like counterculture type kids, but there were a lot of like right wing, like they were like conservative, and it was like that's what was happening in the 90s when I was in high school was kids that were listening to their Rush Limbaugh with their dad and were sort of really had nasty ideas about immigration and race and everything else, and that was sort of like those were the politically active kids in my high school. So I'm wondering in the 60s, like how much are the right wing students a part of your story, and where do they fit in?
That's a good question. In fact, at the book talk I was at San Francisco on Sunday, the person I interviewed, Steve Wasserman, who was in conversation with me, he did say that was like probably the weakness of my book, which I admit every book has weaknesses, so that did not offend me at
You
all. Like,
can't do everything, dude.
yep,
This is a
that's
huge
what it
project.
is.
Yeah.
I like, yeah, the book would be way too long if I tried. But
Uh-huh.
now, when it comes to conservative high school student activism, there's not much written about it. I know scholars are only starting to talk about right-wing activism among college students, but so conservative students, they're there. They're usually the people at every anti-war demonstration. There is a counter demonstration. In some schools, they literally beat anti-war activists up. Like in Texas, when students came wearing black armbands in Austin, Texas. One kid got punched in the nose, and another kid got ganged up in the bathroom, and there was a bonfire in front of the school where they burned armbands and leaflets. There's not
Hmm.
a sustained movement. The thing with right-wing activism, it's more reactionary, though,
Yeah.
not that they're constantly organizing. And even with the high school underground press, conservative students would invert the names of the publications they were going against. So, like in Oklahoma City, there was an underground newspaper titled Get Down. So the conservative students published one called Get Smart. And they
Of
pray.
course.
We're happy that police are in this school. It was a Casson High School, which had a lot of racial tension at the time, and they were criticizing like black students wearing afros. and other things. And then in like Kansas City, Missouri, in a suburb of Kansas City, there was a underground newspaper called the Demobilizer, which was actually a response to the Mobilizer, published by a group called the Kansas City High School Student Mobilization. Interestingly, about underground newspapers from conservative students, they were better funded, which has always been true when it comes to right-wing activism on the right. They got way more, they got funders. They would like give them $2,000 and help them publish this material. Something that students on the left almost never got. Most
Right.
underground papers were just solo endeavors or created by a few people and came out for one or two issues, then disappear. But on the racial front, there's a lot of reactionary as well. And I have a chapter in the book about Collinwood, which was a story I really want to talk about because I lived in Cleveland, Ohio. I was a lead historian for the Civil Rights Trail. And when I was going through the suggested historical sites, one of them was Collinwood High School, a school that experienced 10 years of racial violence. I remember thinking like, man, that's really abnormal because I came from studying the Bay Area. There was racial violence there, but normally it would be like one or two incidents, and then they would have the students convene for some kind of like reconciliation. And for the most part, that actually helped. Not saying it wasn't a utopia, but it helped. So I'm like, okay, I kind of wonder what happened, but I realized there was nothing written about it. Contacted one guy who attended the school, and he'd know two people actually, and they didn't want to talk about what happened. But pretty much what happened at Collinwood in Cleveland, Ohio, it was a neighborhood that was becoming more racially integrated, and white residents who were like too poor to move, started to react with like policies and violence. It's not just students who do it; it's literally people in their 50s who attack 12-year-old kids because they just don't want black kids going to the school with
Ugh.
their kids.
Yeah.
It was concerted, it was organized, and students were a part of it too. You don't get 700 to 800 people crowded outside of a school randomly. They would have secret meetings, and then when black students would come, you would get a bunch of violence that occurred in front of the school. And this occurred for 10 years. Very underreported by the press because they thought that reporting on it would just keep the flames going, but it turns out that wasn't true at all. That when they started reporting on it regularly, you start to see that the violence never subsided. It always continued. So and this occurs across the nation. When schools are desegregating or when there's black students there, you do get a lot of violent reactionary responses from white students who just don't want them in the school, don't want black students dating white girls, which happen at some schools, or a fight might break out into something larger. So, no, there's definitely the political right is definitely a part of this story as well, because
Yeah.
most students are apathetic, but it's only a minority who's on the left as well as on the right.
So how does this story, like, I mean, it seems like a story that just continues, honestly, but like, how does the particular hot moment that you're describing in the 60s and 70s, how does it start to like wane away? Is it like, what forces would you say sort of make this moment, sort of turn or change? Because I know that the FBI and the surveillance and the security part is part of that, but
Mhm.
what else? I mean, for me, like the end of the war might be part of it, right?
Mhm.
Like the war isn't as urgent a topic, but what happens to high school activism in the 70s and
Oh
80s?
yeah. Well, I mean, it continues, but it doesn't have the same flavor as like the 1960s and 70s. But basically, yeah, the war is a part of it. But more importantly, students, they actually won a lot of the things that they fought for. A lot of schools did reform dress codes. They did reform curriculums. A thing when you think about like sex education, Black studies, Chicano studies, that just wasn't given to students. They had to like organize for it, demand for it, and it had mixed results. But over time, many students would get, curriculum reform. They would get like a Black principal or a more diverse faculty. As many school districts across the United States passed high school Bill of Rights documents. So that really allowed a lot of the activism to subside over time. So
Mm,
mostly the victories, and not to mention,
yeah.
it's a transient cohort of people. You get people who are activists and probably let's say they enrolled in 69, they graduate, but if you got a student who enrolled in like 72, 73, they don't really come from that history, even know what happened.
Yeah, right. Of course. I mean, they're only there for a couple of years. I mean, that was the same thing was true with college, I guess. It's like you sort of like you come and go, and it's like where is the force of activism among people that are outside of those institutions? It's partly like what's interesting to me about those institutions is that they're like containers for this kind of activism. But then yeah, like the population moves on. I'm wondering if there were like did you encounter like certain stars of the movement? Were there like because when we think of the 60s, we're often thinking of very particular sort of charismatic figures, usually dudes who were like leaders in the movement one way or the other. But like, were there these types of people in high school that like caught the attention of wider groups or that were stars in the movement one way or the other?
It's like yes and no. So there's no national celebrity. There's no
Yeah.
Jerry Rubin equivalent for high school students. They're
Right.
they're kind of like micro celebrities. So I talk about the story of Grant Cooper, who I thought had probably one of the most interesting stories I talk about in the book. A kid who gets expelled from the New Orleans school district, but at the time meets people from the Southern Student Organizing Committee. For listeners who don't know, the Southern Student Organizing Committee, also called SOC, was like a white SNCC. It was a progressive white student organization in the South to mobilize students in support of like civil rights and opposition to the Vietnam War. Always was a significant minority in the South, but they did so while holding Southern pride. So he meets somebody from Jim Rumley, a member of that group, who then contacts a woman from the group. They're super impressed. They go to New Orleans. They persuade his father to let him join the group. His father, who gets tired of picking him up from juvenile, gives him his fair wishes, and yeah, they take him to Nashville, Tennessee, train him, and give him a gasoline credit card and a Volkswagen. At 16 years old, he's able on his own to just travel throughout the South, helping high school students in the South organize underground newspapers and student groups, and any student uprising that occurred, they would be like field correspondents. They would go in, talk to the students, and then report on it in their underground newspaper called Iceberg, in a way to show readers that, hey, you might read, you might have read this in the past and said like, that's nice, but I can see, student uprising in New Orleans, but not where I live. It's like, oh, here's this uprising that occurred in like rural Georgia. And he told me himself he was kind of like a micro celebrity. I would see in stocks in their underground newspaper, they would say, "Oh, Grant Cooper will be in the area." And he would get students that would come, and he would hold these sessions, and kind of educating them about political organizing. So it happens on like a more micro front, not national. There are people I interviewed who I've seen their names like in different archives. They traveled across the country for conferences, but again, nobody was nationally famous though.
You interviewed a lot of people for your book. How did you find these people, and were they tripping out when you were sort of contacting them and being like, "I want to talk with you about what you did in high school"? Because I mean, it's been a lot of years. It's been a lot of years since I went to high school, and that was the '90s. And I'm wondering, one of the things you point out is that this is an aging population. It's important that we document, like, the voices of these people because they experience things that, otherwise we're not going to know about. But I wonder how did you find these people? What was your experience of talking with them?
Yeah, when I said I had really bad research skills as an undergrad, when I did the paper about the anti-Vietnam War movement, I'm like, I'm gonna contact any and everybody who went to high school. Horrible idea. Most people didn't respond. Others are like, yeah, I went to a few rallies here and there, but I just went for the music. I didn't really care about the other stuff. So
Interesting.
then I
Yeah.
realized we gotta do more research. I would see the names of people pop up frequently, like leaders of independent student groups and publishers of underground newspapers. So I'm like, okay, maybe I gotta identify the movers and shakers. So most people were trial and error. I know a lot of times when people write books about the 60s, they might already have connections or their parents or friends have connections. This was all like code approach. I did not have any relations with these people. I would mail letters. I'll say, this is who I am. This is what I worked on. And I would show them that I did enough research to know their background. And most people were receptive. Not everybody. Some people might have agreed, and then for some reason they disagreed. Other people didn't respond. But no, most people did, and they were more than happy to share their stories. Although they did say, because this is like over a 10-year project, because it was like 50 to 60 years from graduating from high school, their memories might not be good. But having done over 100 oral history interviews, not just for the book, but also for like public history projects, it varies. Some people have tremendous memories well into their 80s and even 90s, and other people, they can have bad memories in their 50s.
Right.
So the level of details of interviews, they varied. Sometimes I was upset when I would find a mover or shaker, like in the chapter in Albuquerque, John Paul, who I talk about in the book. I got in contact with him, but he didn't want to. He just didn't respond.
Yeah.
And it was kind of upsetting. I'm like, oh man, this was like he was like the leader of that movement in Albuquerque. But no, for the most part, I would just mail letters. I learned that's much better than calling people because nobody wants, there's so many spam calls. That's just not a good strategy to just cold call people.
Yeah, I've found it's harder and harder to do that
Yeah.
like it's to just break through the barrier of however many robocalls people are getting. It people don't necessarily think you're real even when you're asking about
Hmm.
stuff like this. I you know I'm sure you had the same experience, and I'm wondering what it was like for the high school underground press because I looked through a million, GI newspapers, underground newspapers, and one of the things that popped out to me was this sort of like there was a certain kind of culture of like the way like the cartoons that were in there. There were a lot of crude, like almost like our Robert Crumb type cartoons, like sort of like pornographic, scatological stuff, lots of like cursing and stuff like that. Were the high school newspapers like that? In other words, like wondering like what the presence of the quote unquote counterculture was in the sort of aesthetic of the underground press. Because I find that whole sort of area really fascinating that these kids were producing stuff that sort of reflected what they were like. You know what I mean? Like what kids were really like then.
Yeah, it varied. Some underground newspapers were just horrendous. It might have been like a one or two sheet piece of paper with a bunch of text.
Yeah.
But others, they increasingly become much more sophisticated. So yes, there are cartoons, there are
Mhm.
crude humor. In fact, in an article I wrote about Indianapolis, one of the reasons why the school district banned the newspaper was, wait, can you curse on this? Because it's a
Yeah, of
profanity.
course. Yeah,
Okay,
it's a
so
podcast. Yeah.
the students published a cartoon called George the Cat, and in the cartoon, the cat is wiring up some dynamite. It's like, I'm so sick of this school. And then the principal walks into the bathroom. He startles him. He jumps into the toilet, and the principal takes a number two. And while he's doing that, the toilet explodes. And George the cat survived. But he has like human feces on his head, some
Oh my God.
bruises, and
Yes.
a cast.
Yes.
And then he quibs, I may have gotten rid of the school, but I'm still eating the principal's shit.
Wow.
And it was
Amazing.
a joke, but the school district banned it, and the lawyers representing the school district said that the underground newspaper promoted violence and even the murder of the school principal.
Oh, come on.
So you would get stuff like that, but more importantly, you would also have like correspondents, people who would travel across the city and interview students who were involved in like underground newspapers or some kind of demonstration, and they would interview them and get quotes from them. And you had photographers who went around the city and took, pictures of demonstration, not just of high school students, but other political activities. They had their own they had their own like letters to the editors, like pages where readers would just say, just say, hey, I agree, I disagree. Oh, hey, how can I learn more? And they published them regardless. Like one of the funniest things I saw, which also comes from Indianapolis, the Corn Cob Curtain, a student from the southeastern part of Indianapolis, which is very rural and very conservative. He's just like, yeah, you guys are so off on Nixon, so right on Fidel. Why don't you go eat Fidel's shit if it's so bad in the US? And he
Hmm.
republished it, just like, hey, we don't care what you send us.
There's so much of that. And the GI newspapers, there were so many things exactly like that. Like it's just toilets, yeah, all sorts of humor that was it was like Mad Magazine. You could tell like this generation grew up with a certain attitude and a certain sort of thing. I'm wondering like if there are drug references in these things because like so much of the underground newspapers and the GI press, they're talking about weed and acid, and like it was part of the discourse of like being young. But with high school, it's a little bit different. I feel like,
I can't remember exactly, but I do know people did talk about drugs, especially hard drugs. Sometimes they felt that students were on like really addictive drugs. They would actually
yeah,
talk out against that. But I've seen articles about like why am I attracted to blondes? And he just talks about how beauty gets reinforced through very media, like
that's
films.
amazing. Wow.
You get people, they'll talk about actually, yeah, they'll talk about like the Vietnam War, they'll talk about student rights, they'll talk about youth employment or unemployment issues. It was a way to educate students about local issues, but also to show them that, there were activism occurring in different parts of the country. So one thing the High School Underground Press does, like any newspaper syndicate, is that they syndicates form and they start a newspaper exchange. So when you would read an underground newspaper from, say, I don't know, Portland, Oregon, you would get stories of like, oh, student uprising in Houston, Texas, or oh, this is what students are doing in Boston. That's how students really learn from one another and kind of adopt similar methodologies across the nation, especially with like high school Bill of Rights
Yeah.
uh, campaign. So yeah, that's what the high school is. It's really phenomenal. It's just like the saying in the book, "Smoking Typewriters." You can't write about the 1960s without documenting the underground press. You can't write about high school student activism in the 60s without talking about the high school underground press.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, I was on the high school newspaper when I was in high school, but it was like the official high school newspaper. But there were
Mhm.
fights of what we were allowed to talk about in there for sure. And now I'm remembering there were students in the class that wanted to write about certain issues that the school was like, you're not. writing about that. And so it makes sense that there would be like a an underground press that would like
Mhm.
sort of be interested in writing, but it feels like the school would be very concerned about that. Like that wouldn't necessarily be something they would want distributed, right?
That's how it forms. I mean, that's what
Yeah.
a high school principal in a suburb of Cleveland said. He's like, the school campus newspaper has to reflect the community. If I get a student talking about some radical subjects, I'm gonna have parents calling me. It's like, hey, what's going on at this school? But
Yeah.
that's really the main reason why underground newspapers in high schools form is about censorship. And they're not all political. I've seen underground newspapers published by theater kids. And actually, believe it or not, teachers would even contribute articles to underground presses. They even sometimes had their own underground newspapers. Sometimes you would get adults that would like praise students for being so politically sophisticated in their analysis
I
of
was
certain
gonna say
issues.
there's got especially teachers. There's got to be so many like left-leaning and liberal teachers that were sort of like cheering this on or supporting it one way or the other.
Oh yeah, I interviewed a guy from Berkeley. He came, I think he came when he was 26. He told me he came in 1966. He said, yeah, a lot of teachers were just fresh out of college. Some of them were still active in anti-war organizations or
Right.
were sympathetic to it. So yeah, the younger teachers definitely were active in the movement and would support students in various ways. Of course, not crossing the line of professionalism, of course. Like if the students walk out, you're not going to escort them because you could lose your job doing that. But sometimes
Well,
teachers will say, hey, if you walk out, I won't like punish you guys.
I wonder at these book events that you go to and the various talks you've done, do people ask you inevitably about like what's going on today and how it connects? Because, I knew that I was going to talk with you this week, and then all this stuff in Minneapolis is happening around ICE being in the city. But then there was an incident at a high school. I don't know if you saw videos and stuff like that, but there were like teachers that were out defending the students from ICE agents coming into the school, and I was like, dude, this is so connected to everything that your book is about. And yet we still talk mostly about college, it feels like. Our politics are still mostly about college students and not as much as high school students. And they're like almost like a blank to us in some ways.
Yeah, the reason why it's really the same reason why it's forgotten. High school student activism is like it's very local, but it's also seen mostly as like a local issue.
Yeah,
They don't have the same sort of cultural resonance as like Yale or Harvard. Like when issues happen at that's seen as more like reflective of like the nation at large. But high school it just seemed like, oh, this is just something that happened in the communities. And if you really want to know what's going on in high schools, honestly have to follow a lot of local newspapers in places you probably never lived and definitely probably never been. Because there's always been high school activism. It's been increasing since the current administration took over. There was a student walkout when I lived in Montgomery County, Maryland, about a mile away from me. Students walked out of school because a
right.
classmate of theirs was deported. But outside of the local press, you honestly wouldn't have learned about it.
It's really really interesting to me because the even when you think about not just Charlie Kirk, who's maybe the most visible example, but you've probably seen all these videos that these guys do where they show up at college campuses and they debate, like all the college students. It's getting to be a genre that I'm like, can we not participate in? I don't know how helpful it is for anyone, but it feels like the college students are the ones that are like the most visible sort of face of like the youth. It just makes me wonder, like your history that you're telling is showing us something that is not as well understood, but at the same time, it feels like there's got to be a lot of high school activism, a lot of high school students that are really really concerned about this stuff. They just feel like it's not studied or it's not talked about in the same way as college students ever.
No, I don't know. I don't even know how to change that because I know what college is like. Colleges are often seen as like the leaders of tomorrow. But even when it comes to college activism, it's usually the elite schools that get most of the attention because when you look at the Supreme Court, you look at
Totally.
Congress, you look at executives, they always come from only a certain amount of schools, like the Ivy Leagues and private liberal arts colleges. I mean, some law firms won't hire you unless you went to a certain school, whereas, high schools are far more scattered. There's not many schools outside of major cities that are known nationally. Like some of the elite schools in New York City are well known. In other schools, they might just be known because they have good athletic programs. They're not really thought about in terms of the academic sense. So I think that's why colleges still overshadows like high school students, for the most part.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. God, your book is so thought-provoking, dude. I really appreciate you coming on and talking with me about it. I'm wondering, it's sort of what do you think about when you think about the future of high school activism and what is happening today, because it feels like a lot of people put a lot of hope in young people.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? It feels like that they're the future. But at the same time, they're sort of so unsupported. It feels like in a lot of ways the attitudes that you're encountering in your book in the 60s and 70s about, well, these kids are just kids and they're like, they don't have rights and they're just sort of subjects. It feels like those attitudes are still kind of present. Like youth is a limiting factor in some ways of citizenship.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right. I think the future, I think student activism will continue. I think now students definitely connect more with social media. Although I will say, when I went on an NPR podcast and I mentioned that, and a person I interviewed for my second book was like, "I understand your point, but at the end of the day, you gotta get out to people face to face.
Yeah.
Reaching out to people on social media, it's fine. It can raise awareness, but to get people really out of their doors and out into the streets." You gotta see them in person and talk to
Hmm.
them and inform them about things, because technology is not going to replace face-to-face interaction, because as human beings, that's what we're used to. I don't think there'll ever be enough time where we'll be comfortable talking through machines. I think that can
Yeah.
replace in-person interaction.
Yeah, and even just like the 5-second viral clips I'm seeing of fights happening in front of Roosevelt High School in Minneapolis, I know that there's a lot more going on at that school than I know. You know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
that has a context, and the viral video is sort of ephemeral. You know what I mean? You see it, it's part of a wave of things I see on my timeline that like piss me off for a second, and then it's like kind of goes away. And sort of like those kids are still at that high school. They're still like I can guarantee they have a lot of concerns that I'm unaware of, and that it doesn't really stick in the same way. Yeah,
No, not like the Parkland students, but the Parkland students, that only stuck because they were talking about gun violence, which of course preceded them and is like a national concern.
that's right. Yeah.
But even that, I don't that kind of withered away, and I don't think, yeah, that didn't really make people look at high school student activism differently, which is
No,
kind of shocking to me.
I know. I mean, it was a moment though, for sure.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's weird and sort of frustrating in how quickly the cycle moves now. The like people are just talking about something really, really powerfully for a couple days and then it goes away. And it feels
Mhm.
like it seems like a product of this social media cycle too.
Yeah, but I think that happened too with the anti-war movement. I mean, media would cover like large demonstrations, and in my book, one thing I try to highlight is that social movements are very unglamorous. Like the more meaningful moments of organizing are the most mundane, dull, boring parts. It's like
Yes.
telephone calls and
Yes.
having meetings and having these debates and going around the city and putting up posters and flyers, but all that stuff adds up to the big events, and that was not something that the media recognized. And it was only something I was able to uncover through the archival records of anti-war groups and the High School Underground Press, as well as FBI documents, which saved an incredible archive of this movement that occurred in the 60s.
I'm glad you said that because I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems like your book is part of a wave of work done by historians that are sort of correcting the cliche story of the 60s. That is about like tentpole moments that are like I call it like the Forrest Gump kind of approach to history where there's like these big moments and high school activism is part of that I don't want to call it boring, but like that real local work that actually gets stuff done. That's something very different than just like the one guy on the standing on the police car that gets all the attention and all the press that we remember.
Yeah, I joke with myself that I write about boring stuff. Like, it's like I'm talking about walkouts and everything, but I'm also talking about students like strategizing in basements and typing stuff on mimeograph machines and hiding leaflets under bushes so their parents don't find out. It's not glamorous, but it's impactful. And sometimes when local events are impactful, students elsewhere learn about them and actually try to copy or get inspiration from them. So
Yeah.
you see that with like the chapter about high school bill of rights, the Philadelphia students, they inspire students elsewhere, but like in Fargo, North Dakota, they create their own high school bill of rights document, but I was inspired by what students did in Minneapolis. It varies. They're constantly learning from each other. That's where the High School Underground Press come from. Most had no idea how to make one, and they would often contact press syndicates or even other groups and learn how to actually construct an underground newspaper.
So cool. It's such a cool history. I want to say the name of your book before we go. It's called High School Students Unite: Teen Activism, Education Reform, and FBI Surveillance in Postwar America. It's out right now from the University of North Carolina Press. Aaron Fountain, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate talking with you.
Oh, same here. Thank you.
All right, my friends, I think that's going to wrap it up for Nostalgia Trap today. I want to thank my guest, Aaron G. Fountain Jr., for a really fun conversation. I swear I didn't know like 99% of the stories he told, and I think that's important. I think we all need to think a lot more about what the kids are up to and sort of their place in the larger structures, not only of the left, but in, the ideas of democracy. This made me think a lot. So go check out his book. It's called High School Students Unite: Teen Activism, Education Reform, and FBI Surveillance in Post-War America. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the Nostalgia Trap Patreon in order to access all our bonus content. We really appreciate it. And we'll be back on the feed for our subscribers this Friday, talking with Justin Rogers Cooper about Trump, about Greenland, about the larger picture of what is happening in a disrupted world and what we can do about it. I wonder what your ideas for that are. Thanks so much for being part of the Nostalgia Trap family. We'll talk to you again very soon. Bye-bye.